Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Norman Sede. I'm a professor here at Carnegie Mellon, and I co-organized the privacy seminar with Professor Hannah Habib. And today is our last seminar of the spring semester, and we have a very special speaker, Professor Alessandro Acquisti, Alessandro, who is a close friend and also has been a close collaborator for the past 20 years since he joined the faculty here at CMU. He is the Trustees Professor of Information Technology and Public Policy at the Heinz College, and he's well known for his seminal research in applying behavioral economics to the understanding of privacy. He spearheaded the investigation of privacy and personal disclosures in online social networks and much more. His studies have won numerous awards. I'm not going to list them all here because we want to move forward. But Alessandro has also testified before the US Senate and House committees on issues related to privacy policy and consumer behavior. His TED Talks, I didn't know that, on privacy have been viewed by over 1.5 million people. And Alessandro, as far as his degrees are concerned, holds a PhD from UC Berkeley, where he worked with Hal Varian, a master's degree from UC Berkeley also, but also with the London School of Economics and Trinity College. So when I asked him to speak at our seminar this semester, Alessandro asked me if it was okay to reflect on his 20 years of research at CMU and the challenges ahead. That's obviously a very ambitious talk, but he said that he was up to the task. And I immediately said yes, obviously. For those of you who don't know, after 20 amazing years here at CMU, Alessandro and his wife, Priya, will be relocating to Boston. So this is also a bit of a bittersweet occasion for those of us who've known him and worked closely with him over the years. So we're going to be missing him. On behalf of everyone here who's worked with him, who's known Alessandro over the years, I would like to thank him for being such a wonderful collaborator and colleague. It has been a real privilege to have him as a collaborator, to be able to work with him. And on a more personal note, I'd like to thank him and his wife, Priya, for their friendship. And so before I forget, this is not the end of the festivities. So Salab is also planning a reception on May 6th. At 3:30 p.m. in Simons A, and we're going to be advertising this more widely. So we hope to see you there as well. And at this point, I'd like to pass the baton to Professor Danielle Nagin, who is the Dean of the Associate Dean of Faculty here at Heinz. Danielle, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you all for coming here. Krishnan is away, so I'm sort of standing in for him. But with these remarks, I've had the privilege of watching Alessandro's career from the time he came here to the Heinz School to the present. And it's been a great honor to watch this spectacular rise. He is not only one of the leading figures in the economics of privacy, but he actually helped to create the field. And it's bittersweet that Alessandro will be leaving us, but I think I can also say that Alessandro's success is a success which I think is shared by the larger university, the Heinz College and the larger university, as being a place where somebody can do the kinds of things that Alessandro has done, particularly at a time early in his career when he was doing things that were non-traditional. Instead of being effectively punished for it, he was rewarded for it. And we should think well of our university for operating in that fashion. So I'll turn it over to Alessandro.
Thank you, Dan, Norman, Hannah, for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. This is getting harder before I even start, but I'll do my best. This is really a love letter, a love lecture to CMU, to the place that accepted me 22 years ago and nurtured me since then. It will be somewhat an autobiographical talk, different from the usual, but the key story will not be my story. The key story I will try to tell is a story that is old as time, even though technologies come and go and keep changing. If you're interested in Greek mythology, as I am, the Minotaur was a monster, half man, half bull, which was not created by nature, but by man, by the hubris of man. And after its creation, every 9 years, 7 Athenian boys and 7 Athenian girls had to be sent into the labyrinth to be devoured by the monster. Until someone entered the labyrinth and tried to face the monster and defeat him, and that was Theseus. The relationship between a Greek myth and modern privacy technologies will probably become apparent, at least I will attempt to do so through my talk. But I believe that the metaphor is already quite naked. The Minotaur is a monster of our own creation. We try to spell it and cast it and lock it into a labyrinth of complexity, hoping that that will protect us. But in fact, the loss and the cost on our society is significant. And we still do not know precisely who will be or what will be the Theseus that will ultimately will liberate us from that. Now, as I promised, I will go back to this, and hopefully you will see the thin red line connecting the themes. But I will start from my personal very first talk, actually, very first talk at CMU. And I will try to understand how, in the space of just 20 years, we went from privacy as a value, as a right, to privacy as a fundamental existential concern for individuals and societies. My very first talk at CMU was about cookies, and back in 1996, cookies were the concern of the time. The idea that on our browsers, there would be some permanent trackers who would tell the websites we visit that we have been there before. How did we go in 20 years from this to that? From the combination of private and public databases, potentially threatening our very civil liberties. How did we go in the space of 20 years from the birth of social media, the attempt to connect people through digital technology, to that very same digital technology dividing us and potentially destroying us? How did we go from the techno-utopia of the 1990s, a declaration of independence of cyberspace, John Perry Barlow, to just in the space of a couple of decades, the fathers of AI machine learning fearing that the AI indeed created a monster? Now, I will not attempt to give you an answer to these questions because it will be pretty hard in 60 minutes, and this is probably not the venue, and perhaps, in fact, certainly there is not a single answer to those questions. But I do believe that the rise of the value of personal data and the collection of personal data and the erosion of privacy in the past 20 years has played a role in this evolution. So let's go back in time and let's go back to that very first talk I was telling you about, which was the very first time I gave a talk at CMU. And that was, according to the files on my computer, that was February 3rd, 2003. I was a student, a PhD student at Berkeley, and I was working with an economist, Alveria, on what we like to call the economics of privacy. I was invited to give a talk here by Ramaya Krishnan and Ashish Arora. They were the two professors here who interviewed me on a phone call and then invited me to come to campus. And I remember the meetings I had when I was here on campus. I remember many of the people are here today. Dan, Marty, John Calkins, Lowell, David Crackard, Karen Clay. I remember having dinner with Rahul and Mike up on Mount Washington. And I remember feeling that this was an amazing place to do privacy research, and in particular, the economics of privacy, because what we were trying to do was to use economic tools. Up until then, all my classes, all the classes I've been doing as a student were about economics, but apply them to a modern problem, or seemingly modern problem, privacy. Now, we had a somewhat narrow view of privacy, or at least I had a narrow view of privacy at the time. Privacy in terms of price discrimination, protecting data about how much you care about goods you want to buy, right? And the economics of privacy, to be honest, had not started with me or with Hal. It started in the 1980s with a scholar, Richard Posner, that is a key representative of the Chicago School of Economics, which is both a very physical place and a metaphorical place for the laissez-faire economics. And I will go back to the work of Richard Posner and his deep-reaching influence in my field, as well as my very respectful and humble criticism for some of the teams recorded in the economics of privacy coming from the Chicago School. But like I said, with Hal, who was also a microeconomist, a modeler, we were interested in understanding the trade-offs associated with protecting and sharing personal information. And these trade-offs exist for individuals, for companies, for society as a whole. For instance, if you allow a seller to know your willingness to pay for a good, your reservation price, as economists say, well, the seller may charge you a price which will extract all the surplus away from the transaction. So protecting privacy becomes economically rational for a consumer. And it was an electrifying period to be a CMU because there was so much openness to interdisciplinary research, as Dan was mentioning just a few minutes ago. So Heinz College in particular, and CMU in general, were open to interdisciplinary research. After all, CMU has in its own DNA the legacy of Herbert Simon, the quintessential interdisciplinary scholar, someone who could contribute to economics, to computer science, to psychology, at the highest level in all these different disciplines. And it was an exciting period even outside of CMU because a number of scholars started working on this mix of economics, information security, not just privacy, piracy. So, for instance, WISE, the workshop on the economics of information security, started in 2002. The very first time was at Berkeley. And then continues and continue nowadays. And some of the people in this room have presented their work there, including Raul and I believe others as well. In fact, the work at WISE expanded over the years to cover also other areas, such as not just information security, but also piracy. And therefore, I feel that there is a thin red line connecting that early generation of the early wave of scholar and scholarship, myself, Rahul, and Mike working on piracy, to the generations that came later of scholars here at the Heinz College working at the intersection of IT and economics, Bei, Avi, Uttara, Ananya, who sometimes work on privacy, sometimes work outside privacy, but there is a thin red line connecting all these works of us. And by the way, before I came to CMU, there was one particular scholar who, if I needed any convincement, told me the final thing that completely convinced me about the importance of coming here. And that was Adrian Perig. Adrian Perig, those of you who come from information security know exactly who Adrian is. He's a giant in the field of information security. And he was a CMU. And when he knew that I'd been offered a job here, he told me, if you're serious about privacy research, you must come to CMU. And that was a period when CMU had other scholars, such as Don Song and Mike Reiter, other giants in the field of information security. None of them are here any longer. They left. They went out to other places, to Berkeley, to ETH, etc. And as you notice, although their losses have been significant, the institution has not lost. The institution and the culture of the institution has been stronger than the individuals. And CMU as a privacy and security powerhouse was and remains exactly that. In fact, we had scholars such as Norman, who probably had joined a few years before, right? And Laurie Cranor, who I believe joined in late 2003, early 2004. And then other generations of scholars who joined Scilab, Nicholas Christine, Via Sekar, Uri Agrawal, Luyo Bauer, who have maintained this tradition of strong privacy security interdisciplinary research. So I came in 2003, and I was very, very happy that I did so. However, some things were admittedly problematic for me. And one thing problematic for me, and sorry, you still haven't eaten, so I feel a little uncomfortable about showing you the photo of a Big Mac. Those of you in privacy research know exactly what I'm referring to. Those of you who are not that into the inside jokes of privacy research, you are about to learn something new in a few seconds. So problem number one, although I love the place, I came here as a modeler because my job market talk, the one I presented in 2003, was a modeling work. I was working with Halveri and was a modeler. But truth to be told, I was never a great modeler. And also my heart was not in it. I was interested in research, but not that necessarily in continuing modeling work. In addition, I started nurturing doubts around using traditional analytical economic, microeconomic modeling to understand privacy trade-offs, and specifically to understand privacy decision-making. Because what I was observing on the ground was different from what I was trying to depict in my models. What I was observing on the ground, and that started already as I was finishing my dissertation and it continued when I was here, was somewhat of a dichotomy between what people were saying about privacy being important to them and what they seemingly were doing in practice. Now, the dichotomy was perfectly encapsulated in an interview with Austin Hill, who was the CEO of an important privacy technology at the time called Zero Knowledge Technologies, if I remember correctly, on the Washington Post, talking about why privacy-enhancing technologies were not being commercially successful. And here we are talking about early 2000. There were privacy-enhancing technologies already back then, but they were not commercially successful. Ask why, he answered famously, well, if you ask 100 people whether they care about privacy, 95 will say yes. If you ask the same 100 people whether they would give away their DNA for a free Big Mac, 95 would say yes again. He had encapsulated something as a joke, which was profoundly true. And we started seeing that comparing just surveys about what people claim about being concerned about, everyone being concerned about online tracking, NSA monitoring them, Google or Facebook surveilling them, and then what people were actually doing online, which was publicly revealing lots of personal information about themselves. This dichotomy, this gap, this contrast came to be known as the privacy paradox, one of the most controversial fields of privacy behavior research because there is an infinite array of possible explanations. There is even debate on whether the paradox truly exists or it is a fiction. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to give you a lecture on the paradox. I'm going to focus on the fact that the paradox stimulated my branching out into a different field of work, which was something that, to be completely honest, I knew very little about. And this is, again, a testament to the incredible place that Heinz and CMU are. Because I started branching out into behavior economics. I started learning from behavior economics and trying to think how behavior economics could apply to privacy and could explain this dichotomy. And one possible explanation, one of many, was the immediate gratification bias, the notion that people may not properly, apart from the fact that technically speaking, discounting future events may be hyperbolic rather than exponential, people may not predict their own tendency to discount in a particular way and may in the future feel that they will protect their privacy, but when presented in the here now with a discount to give away their personal data, they will fall for that and they will give away the personal data, even though in theory they would like to protect their privacy. But truly, if I had remained alone in this work, I would have never really progressed into actualizing these ideas into practice. And again, the testament of the importance of this place to me and the ability to do interdisciplinary research, I was lucky enough to interact with George Lowenstein, very famous behavior economist, who decided to work with me on studies, even though I didn't really have a background in behavior economics. And so I was incredibly lucky to not just work with George, but work with a generation of students, because by then I had started having my own PhD students who were crazy enough to come here to CMU and to work on this new field of research that we decided to call the behavior economics of privacy. So Idris, Ajarid, Laura Brandimarte, Eyal Pierre, who came here as a postdoc, Leslie John, Sonam Samat, later on Jessica Colnago, as well as I was lucky enough to work with other PhD students who didn't work with me on behavior economics, but still work with me on empirical work related to privacy, related to information security, for instance, Sasha Romanowski, Jim Graves. And I'm so lucky to have worked with them, and I'm so proud of the incredible careers that all of them have had thereafter. And I'm also proud, of course, of the works we did together. Some results out of many that I could mention. The paradox of control. Traditionally, in privacy research, control over personal information is construed as a way to protect privacy. And here is important the distinction that economists make between a normative statement and a positive statement. Statements about how the world is, a positive statement, and statements how the world should be, normative statement. And to us, and I'm referring to Laura Brandimarte and George and myself, the idea of control over personal data being a way to achieve privacy was only a normative statement, not a positive statement. What I mean by this is the following. In theory, we want to have control over personal information. There are definitions of privacy that talk about privacy is control. But what, in fact, if control does not create more privacy? What if feeling control over personal data creates paradoxically less privacy? Because it creates this overconfidence and creates even more distribution and sharing of personal information under even more risky scenarios. And this is, in a way, what we believe happens with online platforms. They give us all these privacy settings to create this illusion of control so that you can feel in control over whether your friends or friends will see this photo or not, whether your grandfather or grandmother will see this photo or not. And somehow you feel incentivized, therefore, to share more, and you kind of forget that there is a silent listener there to everything you're uploading, which is the platform itself, right? And whoever the platform chooses to share data with. Another example of the kind of studies we did was a straightforward application of the so-called endowment effect. This is straight up econ lingo, or WTA, WTP, dichotomy, again, econ lingo. But transferred and translated into privacy research means something very simple, which is the evaluation that people will give to the personal information will change dramatically simply based on how you frame the question of how valuable the data is to the person. So that if we give a $10 card, a gift card, like a debit card, a Visa debit card to a person, and we tell them it's anonymous. Everything you will buy with this card will remain protected. We will not know what you do with it. And then we ask them, do you want actually to get a $12 card? This one is $2 more valuable. However, this one will be tracked. So we will know and others will know what you do with this card. Well, if we offer this exchange, 50% of people will say no to the $12 card. In other words, 50% of people will say no. $2, $2 additional dollars is not enough for me to give away my future transaction data. Whereas if you first give them the $12 card, and then you told them, by the way, there is a $10 card, and this one is anonymous. Do you want to swap back? in that case, only 10% of people will actually take the $10 card. And 90% of people will say, no, $2 is too much for me to protect my data. And you have noticed, of course, the two options are in fact exactly the same. The only thing which changed was the framing, the order and the framing. And this has profound implications. Why profound implications? Not just for research, because for research, again, this will not surprise a behavior economist, really. Again, endowment effect is something that generations of scholars have worked on since the 1980s. But from a policy perspective, and indeed, Heinz and CMU are about translating research into policy, I believe this is of fundamental importance, because although when we ran that particular study, Facebook was not that important, was not that big, it was already common in the American policy debate around privacy to trust so-called notice and consent regimes. What I mean is the following. Politicians, policymakers, had certainly already realized in the late 1990s and early 2000s that privacy online was going to be a problem. But the solution, the vast majority of them were advocating, was a free market solution, notice and consent approaches. What is notice? Privacy policies. What is consent? Privacy settings and asking people to consent to the information being used. And this mantra of notice and consent continue over the years, with many companies telling you your privacy is important to us. We give you more control and more transparency. And who would be against control and transparency again, right? These are big, good words. But we go back to the distinction between normative arguments and positive arguments. What do notice and consent really give to users in terms of the ability to protect their privacy? We believe very little. As a matter of fact, and I believe it was George, correct me, George, if I'm wrong, that you, the first to set up this little vignette, which gave us quite a bit of trouble in certain circles later on. The vignette was about Johnny Facebook. Johnny Facebook has particular sexual kinks, which of course we are not going to discuss today, and is considering whether or not he or she should reveal them on Facebook. And Johnny Facebook realizes that, well, if I reveal, this could happen. If I don't reveal, that could happen. And according to this implied theory of consumer decision-making and privacy, Johnny Facebook solves this optimizing equation and chooses the optimal amount of disclosure and votes with his own clicks, right? We didn't believe that that was the case. Not because users are stupid. Our behavior economics of privacy critique to traditional modeling never implies that the user is stupid. Not at all. We rather wanted to point out the problems of incomplete, asymmetric information, boundary rationality, if not outright deception. Because even when regulation starts trying to help, such as, say, the GDPR in Europe or the California Privacy Protection Act in California, even when that happens, industry finds ways sometimes to bypass the regulatory shield, the regulatory protection, and ultimately deceive and manipulate users. You may think that I'm using strong terms for a scholar, for a scientist, by talking about manipulation, but you'll be the judge. Look at this dark pattern. This is an Italian website, an Italian newspaper. If you visit this Italian newspaper from a EU IP address, you will be presented with the by now notorious and famous privacy policy, privacy notice that tells you, of course, we care about your privacy. And then they ask you to, you can, according to the law, agree to be tracked or disagree. But you can notice that the agree button is there, blue and very visible. Can you see the disagree button? Is up there, right? So it is somewhere on the screen, but it's pretty hard to find. So indeed, as Dan was saying earlier, my research was going into directions which may not have been very traditional, but Heinz allowed me to do this. And CMU allowed me to do this because at the same time, and these are scholars that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, Lori Cranor, who had just moved to CMU in, like I said, in late 2003, early 2004, was doing her own work from a more of a computer science HCI angle, and she's credited with the birth and the development of the field of security and privacy usability. And Norman, who had been working on mobile commerce and Internet of Things, started also doing more and more the privacy and the security angles of mobile privacy, Internet of Things, AI, and machine learning. And so I had this incredible opportunity to interact not just with social scientists at Heinz or in SDS, but also with computer scientists, which leads to another big moment of change in my career. And actually, this happened quite early, because in the year 2004, I was teaching my very first classes at CMU in the spring of 2004. I was teaching a class on microeconomics and a class on privacy. The class on privacy was the very first time I taught it. I had maybe 6 or 7 students. One of them was a PhD student from computer science who told me during one class about the existence of thefacebook.com. At the time, it was called thefacebook.com. Thefacebook.com, now known as Facebook, had just started a couple of months before. Because literally, I was teaching spring 2004. Facebook had started, I believe, February, or maybe late January 2004. And I recommended the student to do his final project on thefacebook.com. The student was Rolf Gross. And after he submitted his project, and at the end of the class, I told him we should do research on this. So in the summer of 2004, we decided to create accounts on the Carnegie Mellon Facebook network. And we were the first to have this idea that then became so popular. We had this idea because we wanted to see in the wild what people were disclosing, what they were not disclosing. And so we started creating these accounts, and then we published in 2005 what was the very first academic study of Facebook and of privacy in social media. Facebook looked very different at the time. This is indeed Facebook in 2004. I could, if we were not being recorded, I would tell you interesting, funny story about the complexities and hurdles and anecdotes that happen around our interaction with Facebook at the time. I will just mention that someone decided to believe in our research and decided to protect us and support us and told us that we could go ahead. I hope I'm not putting her in troubles for this, but that person is Mary Jo Dively. And Mary Jo is another example of the importance of institutional support. And again, one yet additional item of gratitude I have for this place. Other places may would have said, oh, this seems a little risky to do. We went ahead. And I'm glad that we went ahead, because we noticed that although the Facebook was super young and at the time was only confined to just a few campuses in the United States, the potential for privacy disaster was there. So in section 4 of that paper, which is now 21 years old, we wrote, well, it would appear that the population of Facebook users we studied seems by large quite oblivious, unconcerned, or just pragmatic about privacy. And then we said the scope of the network users, et cetera, people put themselves at risk both to their digital identities and their offline identities. And then in the rest of the paper, we discussed potential risk. Stalking, demographic re-identification, face re-identification, social security number prediction, user manipulation. This is not me saying, hey, we were right, although we were. But it's more me kind of looking back 20 years later and thinking, my gosh, our worst predictions were not even close to what really happened. So this is what we did afterwards. We did social security number predictions. We had found that there was a predictability, a lack of randomness in the way the Social Security Administration assigns Social Security numbers. And we showed that we could, therefore, infer social security numbers. Not only that, that we could combine demographic data from people who are alive. Date of birth, hometowns, from Facebook. Because people at the time were publicly revealing that. Many people were publicly revealing that. We could combine it with data from the Social Security Administration, the so-called Death Master File, or Social Security Death Index, which is a database of the Social Security numbers of people who are alive. And by combining the two statistically, we could end up predicting people's Social Security numbers. OK, this was interesting and headline-catching, but there was something more important that was going on, and we were part of. It was not just us. We were part of this, of what happened, or something that happened in the last 20 years. That the very notion of personal identifying information, the very notion of sensitive information has completely changed. 20 years ago, personal identifying information was, your Social Security number. And sensitive information was perhaps your sexual orientation. Nowadays, because of all the research in this field, not just that, but that of many other scholars, we know that anything can become identifying information. Once you combine enough tidbits, you can re-identify people, even starting from something that seemingly is completely innocuous and anonymous. And then we decided to do something else. We were mentioning that on Facebook, many people were posting their faces. So we decided to see whether we could take photos of students on campus. You recognize the background, right? It's just up here. This is Hamburger. We could take photos of people, and then we could use PITPAT, Pittsburgh Pattern Recognition, which was a facial face recognizer which had been developed at CMU, not by us. And we could compare in real time using cloud computing. Cloud computing already existed at the time. The study was, the experiment was run in 2009, although we published it a few years later. We could basically compare the image of the person in front of us to a database of images coming from Facebook. And in real time, we could find people's profiles, which means that we could give a name to the anonymous person in front of us. The FTC, that summer after we presented our results, organized a workshop on facial recognition, which was a very important workshop because there, people, industry scholars, policymakers started discussing the problem of how online digital information, photos, can then be used to recognize people offline. I'm going to go back to that in a moment. But then we decided to push the envelope even further, because if you combine the two studies I just mentioned to you, right, the one about predicting SSN and the one about recognizing faces, if you put them into one single mix, what do you end up with? You end up with the proposition that you could start from an anonymous face in the crowd, and then you could use facial recognition to find, and social media data, to find a name for that person. But when you find a name, you find also lots of other information. That other information is not necessarily super sensitive. It could be date of birth and hometown. But once you have that, then you can predict something sensitive, as we had demonstrated. So the story became, can we start from a face and end up predicting Social Security numbers from a face? And the answer was indeed yes. Of course, not with incredibly high accuracy, but enough to prove a point that anonymity, due to our own, there is a behavioral element always coming back, during our own predisposition to reveal so much about ourselves, anonymity is truly eroding. We push the envelope even more. We develop an iPhone app which would allow us to point the camera to a person in front of us, and then in real time predict the SSN, and then show it overlaid on the face of the person, an example of augmented reality. And we were doing all of this not because we wanted to make a startup, but because we wanted to raise attention on the profound civil liberty and policy implication of the technology. Keep in mind that more or less around the time where we were doing this research, the first megapixels cameras were becoming popular. I don't know if you are familiar with megapixel cameras, but there are cameras that can do the following. This is a photo from either Montreal or Toronto after a Canadian hockey team won the Stanley Cup. And this is the crowd celebrating the victory. Well, if you zoom into this photo, because this photo was taken with a megapixel camera, you can zoom in and actually see the distinct faces in that crowd. Okay? And by the way, this photo is at least we are in 2025, at least 12 years old. Nowadays, the definition, nowadays it would be like now if we're looking at, you know, a VHS movie about the Steelers from the 1980s, right? The kind of blurriness of the image. And think about having the computational power, which of course now we have, to not only recognize every person in the crowd, but also overlay social media data so that we can find a connection between these people. So we can instantly know that these three people are connected. And perhaps, if you think about this in security terms, this is incredible, because you recognize, oh my gosh, there are three suspicious individuals who pretend not to know each other, but they're all converging towards this public space at the same time. That's a benign scenario. Of course, you can think about the much less than benign scenario, right, of how this technology can be used to infringe or, in fact, even demolish civil liberties. And this got the attention, and again, CMU is an amazing place, of folks in the drama department. And I was lucky enough, Ralph and I were lucky enough to be connected to Rob Handel and Kamala Sankaram, who were interested in privacy and in doing, as crazy as this may sound, a musical about privacy. And the musical took place, and he went on stage. We went on stage in just off Broadway in New York at an unfortunate period of time, late 2009, just before COVID. The musical was called Looking at You, and it basically was based on a startup which basically had created in the fictional story what Ralph and I had created. This app where you can recognize people in the crowd. And what is really cool about the show was that you see the screen. This is a still from the show. You can see screens on tables and screens in the theater. People were sitting, the audience, kind of in cafe style, each at a table, and they would have tablets on their screens, as well, or tablets on their tables, as well as screens around the room. And as the show progresses, their personal information would start appearing on the screen, on their tables, and on the screens, because we had found the information of audience members before they entered the theater, and we would slowly enter it into the story, so that people initially perhaps they would only see something like, oh, that's interesting, that's a photo of Pittsburgh. Okay, coincidence. And then after some minutes, they would see, no, it's not just a photo of Pittsburgh, it's a photo of Heinz College. And as the show progressed, the information became more personal, more sensitive. It was a way to make people feel viscerally the erosion of privacy in the modern society. Now, this was presented as dystopian future, but in fact, the reality is, it was not far behind. The company ClearView AI made billions of dollars, again, doing what Ralph and I had created for absolutely not commercial purposes. Essentially, they took down, they mined publicly available social media faces, and then they sold the services to agencies in the United States and around the world to re-identify people offline. Again, profound policy implications and the creeping risk of seeing our liberties being eroded. And this theme of how the digital can impact the physical also permeated other Facebook research. This one was with Christina Fong. We were very interested in how where the legislator in the United States, as in many other countries, has, with wisdom, decided that certain information should not be used in interviews, should not be used to make decisions about hiring or promotion. Well, the same very information nowadays is provided by ourselves online. So an employer may not be able to ask you whether you have kids or plan to have kids, but they may search online whether you do. So we ask ourselves, what if we send different profiles to real job openings in the United States with different names? And we manipulate their Facebook profile. So we send the CVs. The CVs are identical in terms of professional attainment, educational background. But if the employer decides to search online the names on the CVs, they find the Facebook profiles we created. And now they are exposed to personal information which is not on the CV, such as whether they are gay or straight, whether they are Christian or Muslim. Will employers do it? And will it affect their decisions? And the answers are yes and yes. The second yes, a qualified yes. We notice the differences between employers living in certain states, whether more conservative or more liberal. But the point is that, yes, what we reveal online can impact what happens in our real world. There were also other studies which gave us a little bit more hope, such as I told you that we started with Ralph doing a study back in 2004 about Facebook disclosures, how much people were revealing on Facebook. Well, Ralph and I kept doing that over the years. So we kept mining data because we were interested in studying longitudinally how disclosure would change, whether people would disclose more or less over time. And look at this. This is, for instance, the CMU Facebook. This is a constant, same panel of users, which we track from 2004 up to 2011. And this is about their disclosure of their birthday. And you can see how in 2004, around 90% of people were revealing their date of birth on Facebook. That number kept going down and down and down and down, and it reached less than 20%, in fact, around 15% by 2011. This suggests to me some endogeneity privacy disclosure behavior. People over time became more careful with their personal information. They wanted to reveal less publicly. But this is not the end of the story. We have another field here. This is high school. You can see high school starts exactly at the same probability of disclosure as birthday. So in 2004, again, about 90% of people were revealing their high school information. The number kept decreasing, suggesting that people were less and less willing to disclose their high school over time. Again, endogeneity of privacy behavior. But you notice that there is something different in the second graph compared to the first, right? There is a shock, which seems small if you compare it to the entirety of the y-axis, but in fact, in percentage terms, is enormous. Because between 2009 and 2010, the percentage of Carnegie Mellon Facebook users profiles who decided to show, who were showing publicly their personal information doubled from 20 to 40%. And they all suddenly felt that high school information was okay to share? No. Facebook had changed the interface and it changed the default visibility settings so that this information now will be by default visible. So this is a powerful story to me because the first half of the graph shows privacy endogenous behavior, how it's not true that people don't care about their privacy. In fact, people constantly try to manage their privacy online, even their privacy in public, something that may surprise politicians, but in fact, it is well known by social psychologists back from the 1990s. People constantly try to manage privacy in public. The second half of the picture shows the exogenous shock, shows the power of dark patterns, shows the power that the architects of choice, essentially the designer of platforms we use, have on determining our privacy outcomes. And once you can control behavior, once you can control that behavior, what else you could control? Well, there was a study which I want to tell you in advance did not show statistically significant results, but I do feel that in the future something like this may happen if it's not already happening, in which we wanted to study the following. Here, let's say that an advertisers have access to your list of Facebook friends, and they find that you are friends of Alessandro. And then when they're trying to, you know about behavior advertising, right? Behavior advertising is about showing you an ad which is specific to your interest, okay? Now think about something different, where it's not the product being targeted to you, but it is the very ad which is changing in real time to be somehow at a visceral, undetectable level, more influential to you. So let's say that there is a male spokesperson, a model, And let's say that the advertisers in real time can combine, create a face morph of the model face and your friend's face. So this is Ralph and me. This is 70% Ralph, the better half, and 30% me. And now imagine that next time you see an ad, that ad is being, in real time, adapted to have the face of someone who contains your friend. But your conscious brain does not detect it because it's only 30%. Your conscious brain feels, okay, this is a generic male model. Your unconscious brain may be more positively predisposed, and this is called visceral targeting. Again, we didn't find significant results in this. They were trending in that direction. They were not significant. But think about more deeply about the power of, now that we have so much information about ourselves, of changing in real time the world around us. Now, which brings me back to economics, because by then, with this research, we're about 2015, 2016, 2018, by then, the field where I started from, the economics of privacy, had exploded. So much so that I was proud, very proud, with two esteemed colleagues, Curtis Taylor and Liad Wagman, to be able to write for the Journal of Economic Literature a review of the economics of privacy. That meant that the economics of privacy had reached mainstream. And typically, when a field you have been working on for a while reaches mainstream, you are happy and proud. And while I was happy and proud, I was actually extremely concerned. And to explain why I was extremely concerned, I have to go back, as I promised I would, to an eminent scholar I have enormous respect for, Richard Posner. Richard Posner, again, a father of economics and law research, as well as the father of privacy economics research. In 1981, in the American Economic Review, so this is the gold standard for economists to publish in, on the economics of privacy, wrote three remarkable things on the very first page of his article. First, privacy is about concealment of information. It's about hiding information. Two, the information that people want to hide is negative information. Three, if we allow this negative information to be protected, we create inefficiencies in the marketplace. We create frictions. Because if, for instance, the employee or prospective employee wants to refuse a drug testing because they've been smoking joints, and they don't want the employer to know, if a law stops employers from doing random drug testing, that will create economic inefficiency. The employer will end up with a bad employee. Not only that, but in a couple of years later, 3 years later, Richard Posner, in another piece on economics of privacy, had been quite aggressively stating his views on regulation. In the perspective offered by economics and the common law, the recent legislative emphasis on favoring individual and denigrating corporate organizational privacy stands revealed as still another example of perverse government regulation of social economic life. So a clear attack on privacy protection, privacy regulation. And what was the problem I had by 2016 with my field? That to some extent, in fact, to a larger extent, applied work on the economics of privacy tended to focus on the cost of privacy protection, on the extent the privacy regulation and technological protection creates economic harm. So that's why I went back in the last 10 years of my research. I went back to the roots I had as an economist. And I started doing lots of empirical work, applied economic work, to see, well, is that always true? And I found out that no, it's not always true. That, of course, if you look for costs, you find them, especially if you look for short-term, immediate transaction costs of privacy. Because, yes, reducing tracking can increase, for instance, advertising cost and reduces advertising effectiveness. But what else is happening? Well, in a series of studies, and you can see the students that I work with, Veronica Marotta, Christopher Scher, Logan Warber, Fizz Lefreur, Zidrin Ding, Sagar Baviskar, Eduardo Mustri, again, Idris Ajarid, Ryan Steed. In a series of studies, we try to challenge the conventional wisdom the conventional wisdom, that privacy regulation reduces economic efficiency and only creates economic costs. We started showing that the GDPR didn't harm ability of publishers to produce quality content in European Union. We showed that Apple ATT, which is a privacy framework, didn't decrease the availability of apps in the Apple information ecosystem. We showed that a global tracking regulation would have much more nuance than previously believed impact on publishers' revenues. We showed that behavioral targeted ads may perhaps reduce your search costs, yes, by presenting you with things you are more likely to be interested in. But you know what? More likely than not, they also are associated with higher prices for the things you pay and lower quality of vendors. And we also shows that we have technologies such as differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, which allow to protect data while also doing analytics with very little cost. There is a cost. As economists, we know there is no free lunch. So once we deploy things such as differential privacy, which is nowadays the most popular tool for protecting data while allowing analytics, once we deploy these tools, yes, we create some cost. But the cost is marginal if you compare it to many other costs that happen in our data. And this also led me to, by far, the most difficult experiment I have ever tried to run. In this experiment, again, with many people who are CMU connected, Cristobal Chair, who was a postdoc here and leads the project with me, Li Jiang, Florian Schaub, both were postdocs, Zidrin Ding, who is a PhD student here, Cristiana Firullo is a Cornell, Yucheng Li, who is also a PhD student here, and myself. And to be honest, many others, because we probably had 40 or 50 arrays over time. Some are in this room, and I'm so delighted that they are. We tried to do something that had never been tried before, to create an infrastructure to study individuals' behavior online under 3 treatments. Baseline, people see ads and they are targeted. Ad blocking, they don't see ads. And anti-tracking, they see ads, but the ads are no longer targeted. And this was an immense effort. We are just about finally to launch. And to be completely honest with you, this has come at a very significant personal cost as well. I fear also much sacrifice and cost for the people involved with me in this project. And this is also one of the personal costs has been the fact that in the last 2 years I've been essentially a ghost. And I've been not as social and interacting with many of you as I would have liked, especially once I knew that this would be my last year CMU. And I've not been able to take advantage of the social and intellectual interactions I would have liked to have, because essentially this project has devoured my time. But I don't want to focus on the sad part. I want to focus on the happy part. The fact that this project would not have been possible in any place other than this. And I'm including places I come from and places I may move to. Because it really takes an institution. The work that I've done here has been made possible by people like Trish and Emily, Irina, Anne, Esma, Lori, who help with the contracts, with the RB, with the data use agreements, with finance. Heinz IT. The complexity of the servers we have to run here, without Rob Jones, James Trimby, without Dan Fassinger, who is the head of our CMU Campus Cloud, and without the Pittsburgh Supercomputer Center, that would not be possible. Without the students, the many students, many undergrads, many grad students, and that I found over the years, and Sean Beggs, Andy Wasser, Joe Mertz, Ron Delphine, were so incredibly gracious to help me recruit students over the years. Without all of them, it would have been impossible. It would have been impossible to run this. And the funding itself. Scilab put money in this. Heinz College put money in this. The Block Center put money in this. The Sloan Foundation. And then other foundations put money into related work, such as MacArthur Foundation, Knight Foundation. I'm just amazed and incredibly grateful, in addition to being somewhat exhausted. But I do hope that finally the fruits of all this collective work will be born. But let me go back to Richard Posner and to why I found, with great respect for his enormous contribution to the field, why I found his view of economics or privacy limiting. And of course, I'm not attacking him because as a pioneer, he was writing 40 years ago. He may have not predicted what was going to happen. But in the same paper, where he attacks privacy regulation as a perverse government intervention in socioeconomic life, notice page 26, in the same paper, earlier, page 19, he wrote the following. I will sidestep definitional problems by simply noting that one aspect of privacy is withholding or concealment of personal information. Do you realize what is happening here? Richard Posner is admitting that privacy may be many things, definitional problems. But he's saying, I will skip the definitional problem. I'm going to focus on privacy as withholding, concealing data. So Posner is saying correctly, as a scientist should do, privacy can be many things, but because I want to do rigorous work, I'm going to focus on this narrow aspect. So far, so good. The problem is the second part of the analysis, because we go from analyzing one aspect of privacy to make a conclusion such as, oh, you see, privacy regulation is this perverse intervention on social life. And you see why this is problematic, because it misses the entirety of what privacy really is. And in fact, a scholar such as Jack Hirschleifer, writing at the same time as Posner, attacked Posner by saying, your view is not simple, it's simplistic. You're missing the point. And what is the point that we may be missing when we take a reductionist approach to privacy? The impact that personal data can have in the context of social media, in influencing our decision, not just as individuals, not just visceral targeting, what we buy, but how we vote. The impact that personal information can have on our lives, how searches that we do may once be used for something that we may have never expected. The possibility that algorithmic-driven personalization can ultimately cause something like genocide. And I'm not playing here conspiracy theorists. This comes from a third-party report that Facebook itself commissioned, an autonomous third-party report after the disaster in Myanmar. Genocidal violence, which was indeed fostered by Facebook algorithms, not intentionally. It's not like any Facebook engineer wanted to foster hatred and create murders. But that's what happened, because that's how the algorithm works. The algorithm wants to make you click on increasingly incendiary comment material. And this is a privacy problem, because the algorithm is fed by our data. And if we look into the future, I'm not so sure that things are going to get better. Because the future is not just LLMs, which are problematic in their own respect from a privacy perspective. The future is neural privacy. As you know, Facebook has been trying for quite a while to promote these smart glasses. What you may not know is that future versions of these smart glasses may use technology that Facebook has acquired to essentially try to read your brainwaves, so that you can control your smart glass through your brainwaves. And I don't want to cheapen the discussion by using cheap jokes, but do you want Facebook, do you want Mark Zuckerberg to be able to read your thoughts? You see the enormous potential for harm. The technologies that we wanted to create 20 years ago for freedom, a declaration of independence of cyberspace, have become the very technologies that now constrain us. We may have created a monster. Now, I'm not going to tell you that everything is going to work out. I don't think anyone can know. I do feel, however, that historical perspective can help a little bit. And while my talk up until now has been from the past into the future, so the arrow of time, in a way, was from past to present to future. Now I'm going to go in reverse, back and back in time. A few years ago, Vint Cerf, which is one of the fathers of the World Wide Web, as well as Google chief evangelist at the time, gave a talk at the Federal Trade Commission in which he famously said, privacy may be a modern anomaly. Essentially, his notion being that perhaps our ancestors lived with a life of no privacy, of communal sharing. And then through the Industrial Revolution, privacy arose and became a bourgeois value. And nowadays that we have created these platforms that monitor everything we do, we are just going, it's kind of like a reversal to the norm, right? We're going back to our ancestral state of no privacy. Is that true from a historical perspective? I feel quite justified in saying it's absolutely not true. Not because I say that, but because there is so much research coming from historians, from anthropologists, from ethnographers, from social psychologists, who have studied these things. And they have found evidence of privacy-seeking behavior across populations around the world, not just Western population, not just bourgeois values and communities, in Java and Bali, in the Tuareg, the Blue Man, and going back in history, in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, going back in history, references to privacy in the Torah, references to privacy, what in modern terminology we would call informational privacy in the Quran. The very story of Adam and Eve in the Genesis can be read as a privacy story. Adam and Eve, once they eat the fruit of the tree of good and evil, the fruit of knowledge, discovering knowledge, they also discover their nakedness. And that's why they feel ashamed, they feel embarrassed. Up until then, they have no problem being naked. And now they cover themselves with in Renaissance pictorial tradition, with the leaves of the fig tree. And what do they cover? What in English terms we call their privates. Not only that, but there is privacy-seeking behavior. There is evidence of privacy-seeking behaviors in animals. In the delightful chimpanzee politics book by Franz de Waal, one of the most famous primatologists in the world, there is a remarkable story that my wife Priya and I heard when we were traveling through Alaska a few years ago on our RV, and we were listening to an audiobook. And we heard about the story of Dandy. There are two stories of Dandy that clearly describe privacy-seeking behavior. One is of a sexual nature, and I decided to spare you of that particular story today. The other is more PG-rated. And it goes like this. After researchers hid grapefruit in the chimpanzee enclosure as part of an experiment, Dandy, who, by the way, Dandy was not an alpha male in the group, was a young chimp. And therefore, that's important, given the chimpanzee politics, because a young male has to be extremely careful about what they do, not to annoy the senior males in the group. So they have to be very, very careful. Dandy was able to find, Dandy was very smart. He's the first one to find the food. So, however, when a good number of apes passed the place, the grapefruit were eaten, Dandy too passed by the hiding place without stopping or slowing down. He pretended not to know anything. And then after the group passed, came back, got his grapefruits. Dandy was exhibiting very strategic protection of information behavior. He was being very smart. So there is substantial evidence that privacy norms and behaviors change dramatically across cultures, but all cultures across time and space show a desire for privacy. But if so, why? So a few years ago, Laura Brati-Marte and Jeff Hancock and I published in Science a evolutionary conjecture. The notion that privacy may actually have evolutionary roots. As strange as it might sound, follow me for a second. Back in the days, hundreds of thousands of years ago, the ability to detect the presence of others in your physical proximity. And the ability to quickly distinguish between friends, foe, stranger, or non-person would have been crucial for survival. That's why privacy is physical. We feel, when someone is staring at you, right? Somehow you feel it and you turn, and indeed, they were staring at you. We have this sixth sense. We have a sense of privacy. Now, the problem is that when we go online, our sensorial cues that we have evolved to use to detect privacy concerns and privacy risk don't work. You don't see Google following you at night. You don't hear the NSA capturing everything you do. You don't smell Facebook close to you. So we face an evolutionary gap, which is a problem that we face nowadays as a society. We have created this technology, and we have not adapted to this technology. Now, as crazy as this may sound, it's consistent with some of the work of what is, for me, the most important scholar of privacy of the last century, and nowadays, too, to be honest, Irwin Altman. Irwin Altman wrote two things about privacy, which to me are the most profound sentences ever written. First, privacy is culturally specific and culturally universal. The point I was making earlier. It is diverse, but we all seem to be driven to it. And privacy is a dynamic process of boundary regulation, the opening and closing of self to others. And this is profound because privacy is not just about static control or concealment of negative information. Privacy is about opening and closing. If I share a secret, that's privacy. If my secret is betrayed, that's a violation of privacy. So when we have the ability to control this opening and closing, the sharing of the self to others enriches us. When we lose that control, it can enslave us. Which is why, yes, I do believe that we may have created a monster, or at least the opportunity for a monster. And I believe that by now you can see my thin red line of what the monster I believe is. The technologies we have created are powerful, and they're beautiful. They could lead to many incredible things if we can control them. If they control us, then we are really lost in the labyrinth. And to be honest, we don't know who or what the Theseus that will free us from that will be. The only thing I know is that if you believe my story, privacy is a universal drive of human beings. And therefore, the reason for hope that I do have at the end of perhaps too gloomy talk is that you cannot beat something which is part of human nature. Technologies come and go, but our nature will always try to seek privacy, to carve out a private space out of this public surveillance. Now, it may appear there's this self versus others tension may be jarring to some of you if you believe in religious or philosophical traditions that fundamentally believe in the imaginary nature of the self, who subscribe to non-duality, the fact that we are actually all part of a single one. But I believe that privacy is, in fact, even if you believe in non-duality and in perhaps the imaginary nature of the self, I believe that privacy is still necessary to arrive there. Because privacy is, in a way, what allows us the space to grow and to get into a process of self-actualization, awareness, and realizations about these boundaries. And then it's up to us whether ultimately we believe that we want to share with others or not. So I will forever be grateful for these coincidences in life that allow me ultimately to work in a space which is simultaneously as policy relevant, as technologically relevant as privacy is, while it's also universal. And while the thirst for new adventures, which clearly has characterized my life for the past 20 years, although these last 20 years feel like months, even if that thirst for adventure is what has generated the imminent move, the next move in my wife Priya and my life, I will never forget the institution that made all of this possible, that accepted me 20 years ago and nurtured me since then. So thank you.